Right, this is hopefully a short video to describe how to do the Digestive Physio Ex. So I have given you this document, which if you click on it, looks like this. It's got a little bit of explanation, and it's got data tables. These data tables will look a little bit different than what you actually get when you do the activity, but the tube setups that you need to know about to answer questions on the lab exam or anywhere else that are here are what you need. So whatever is in the new edition that's not here is not important. I think first we'll go over a little bit of what it looks like, and then we'll talk about this stuff here. And I'll try not to make this a lecture about the whole thing, but hopefully give you enough information so that you can learn what you're supposed to learn. So, you will have this handy should you decide you want it, and then you will click on this, and it will look like this. One thing you want to note is that the pre-lab quizzes are before the post-lab quizzes, so you don't want to start with 1, you want to start with 6. The other thing I should point out is that your score on these quizzes, which is going to be between 0 and 6 points, is your grade for the assignment. So this is how I grade whether you've done it or haven't done it. What I'm going to ask you questions about is the data. So you want to do well on these quizzes so that your grade is good, but on the lab exam, when you finally get questions about this, it'll be on the data. And I should also point out that not everybody's going to be done with this in time to review the data for the quiz next week. So this is not on the lab quiz, and it's not in the lecture quiz because it's lab homework. So if you don't understand it right now, we will go over it the week after this in our review session, and then you'll make sense of it, and you won't have to answer questions on it until after we've gone over it. So, that being said, what you are going to want to do is start with the pre-lab quiz, and it doesn't really matter which one, but in the old way of doing it, we always started with, where did it go? Starch. So open this one, and here's your pre-lab quiz. Before you take it, you want to open the activity, and then read through. And this you do want to read carefully because it tells you what you need to know. So you're going to have to understand about controls. We are going to focus on negative controls. There is such a thing as positive controls. But it muddies the experiment, I think, when we talk about that. So don't worry about positive controls, but you don't want to worry about negative controls. So read through this so you know what all of this is. And then, yeah. Sorry, I'm thinking and clicking at the same time. So read through all that. This is a quiz you can do if you want to. Remember, this one is what you're graded on. But this is probably not a bad way to review. I'm just going to click through it and then click continue. So you've read, hopefully you understand a lot of things. Now you can come here and do your pre-lab quiz. Then go back to here, do the activity. Then the tricky part is after you're done with the activity, and I should say when you do the pre-lab quiz, don't hit next, because when you hit next, I'll say okay. It now takes me to the pre-lab quiz for the next thing, and we don't want to do that. We want to do pre-lab, experiment, post-lab. So do your pre-lab quiz, and then go back to Digestive Physio Ex. Right, so you're gonna, whatever order you want to do these in, I started with amylase. So I opened the amylase Prelab Quiz. We'll just do the whole thing again, right? There we go. Right, so you open it, here's your Prelab Quiz, you open your assignment, or the activity, you read through the activity. Yay, I understand everything, I am the master of amylase. Then come back here, do your Prelab Quiz, and then go back to the assignments. The experiment window is still open, it's a different window. So then you're going to do your experiment. And this one works a little bit different. I'll show you just the first part. It tells you to do a test tube, and then mercifully it just does the rest of the test tubes for you. It doesn't make you drag all 8 of them over there. And this is one of the instances where things are different. My data table in the sheet that I gave you has 7 tubes. This has 8 tubes. Because in the old version of it, we don't freeze anything. But freezing doesn't, we don't learn anything from the freezing, so it's fine. So you do that, you hit next. And then it tells you everything to do down here. So you're not doing drop next, drop next. It says tube 1, add these 3 things. Amylase, starch, pH 7 buffer. So you go amylase, amylase, starch, pH 7 buffer. And then you'll do tube 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 8. And it'll tell you to boil 1, freeze another, then do the incubation, and then you'll get your results. So if we go back to the data table, and this, so for each one of these, right, you've got an enzyme, which in this case is amylase, that is going to digest a substrate, which in this case is starch. The product of that digestion is sugar. So you want to know how the tests work. In this case, there are 2 tests. And then, based on what you know about amylase, and how it should respond to different pHs, you could predict what should happen here. Now, you're going to have the results, but I'm going to ask you why the results are the way they are on the exam. So just looking at this, we have not gone over the iodine and the Benedict's yet, so I will briefly tell you that iodine is brown. This is iodine potassium iodide. When it comes into contact with starch, it turns dark blue. So that would be a positive reaction, so we'd put like a plus here. And Benedict's is, I believe, blue before you do a test with it. After you perform the test, in the presence of sugar, Benedict's solution turns red. So that would be a positive result, meaning that there were sugars there. So here we're actually testing for both substrate and product, so we can see how much product was produced by our enzyme and how much substrate is left over. With the other 2 experiments, we're just tracking substrate or some measure of enzymatic activity, so this one's a little different. So looking at it, the starch test is supposed to tell you, or the iodine test is supposed to tell you if there's still starch left over. The presence of starch left over means the enzyme didn't work. And the Benedict's test tells you whether or not there's sugar. The presence of sugar means the enzyme worked. So you'll get results for what happens if you boil it. Amylase starch, pH of 7. And then don't worry about the maltose one or the freezing one. We don't care. We just want to look at pH. Amylase starch, pH of 2. Amylase starch, pH of 9. So you want to be thinking should amylase work best at 7, 2, or 9? And then these two, oh, yeah, totally ignore number 5. You'll notice there's amylase, but instead of starch, there's water. And here there's starch, but instead of amylase, there's water. These two are your negative controls. So really what we're looking for, right, is the presence of sugar, because that means starch was digested and you went from a polysaccharide to a monosaccharide, from a starch to a sugar. So there should only be Benedicts if amylase acted on starch to produce sugar. We want to ensure that that is so. So we have a tube that doesn't have starch and a tube that doesn't have amylase. So these we know should test negative. If either of these two test positive, something is wrong with the test. We can't trust the rest of the results. But if these two test negative, without enzyme, there's no sugar. Without starch, there's no sugar. When any of these other ones show that there is sugar, that means that the sugar is there because the enzyme digested the starch. So the negative control allows you to trust your positive results. And so anytime you see sugar in place of one of the important reagents like the substrate or the enzyme, that's a negative control. So you'll get the results for this on the exam, and we have one activity that we may do in class. I'll give you a blank table and say, how should tube 3 respond for the starch test and why? How should tube 6 respond to the Benedict's test and why? Something like that. So you'll have to predict what should happen and why. The why part being the tricky part, because you'll have your old data. And then it's the same thing, right, for pepsin and lipase. You're testing it under different conditions. For these two, we don't have a test for leftover substrate. We just have a test that tells us how much of our product is being made. And you want to understand how these two things work, because each test works a little bit differently. Right, this says optical density, so you want to read and say, why does optical density change if pepsin is digesting something? And why should the pH change if lipase is digesting an oil? So understand how all the tests work. So again, you're going to pick one of these, do your Prelab quiz, and then come back here, do your activity, and then you can close it out. And so we just did the Prelab for starch, then you'll do your PostLab after you've generated your data and answer that. So where are we? This is PostLab quiz for assessing starch. The easiest thing to do is then go back and pick the next Prelab thing you want to do. So Prelab pepsin. Open the activity, read about it, do the quiz, come back here. Then do the activity, come back here and select your PostLab quiz. So you'll do that for starch, protein digestion by pepsin, and lipid digestion by lipase. So you'll have 3 lab reports that Physio Ex lets you generate, or you can fill out these 3 charts. And then when we have our review session, we'll go over how the data came out and why they came out the way that they did. I think that's everything. So remember, you don't have to do anything with your lab reports. If you generate them, or if you fill out this chart, you don't have to send it to me. Your grade is these pre-lab and post-lab quizzes, and then it's the charts we'll go over so that we make sure everybody learned what they were supposed to learn. So that's due by, well, I'm not going to say when in case I use this video again in a different semester. But you should know for this semester when this is due, and make sure that you try it a couple days before it's due so that you're not emailing me an hour before it's due on the due date saying, Physio EX is confusing or something. Because I'm just not going to respond if it's an hour before it's due. So I think that's it. That's all. Good luck. I know it's probably a bit of a pain in the butt.